So, thank you for joining us to talk about travel accessibility issues this holiday season. Introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Kendra Davenport. I'm the president and CEO of Easterseals.
Tell us about the new campaign you're launching.
Thank you, Stephanie. We launched an air accessibility campaign last week at the start of the holiday travel season. While attention around travel and inaccessibility is really heightened, and yet this is an everyday issue. This isn't just a holiday travel issue. Inaccessibility affects the 61 million Americans who identify as having a disability. That's a quarter of the American population. And right now, air travel is not accessible.
Can you give us some examples?
Yeah, for sure. I think when someone who is non-disabled goes to the airport, get on a flight, our biggest concerns most typically are, is our flight going to be on time? Is our baggage going to get there? Are we going to make our connection? When someone who has a disability travels, the challenges are much more complex, and they start with TSA. Getting through TSA often means that people who utilize a wheelchair are subject to long waits. And Easterseals really believes, and disability advocates believe, that TSA agents could really benefit from additional training on how to make security screenings more accessible and, frankly, more dignified for people with disabilities. But once they get through TSA, the nightmare is just beginning, because when they arrive at their gate, passengers in wheelchairs are often forced to give up their wheelchairs. And the airlines are the only mode of transportation that actually calls upon someone in a wheelchair to surrender their wheelchair and to get into the wheelchair that the airline provides, which is very, very narrow, as you know. You've likely seen them on flights, to accommodate getting down that aisle. Most people struggle with a rollerboard bag that they're going to put in the overhead that fits in the overhead. They struggle to get it down that aisle. Imagine leaving a full-size wheelchair and being forced to get into this narrow version, which lacks padding, and having airport personnel move you to that wheelchair that is not like the wheelchair you have. It really puts them at risk for injury, but also humiliation. Everyone is watching as this unfolds, and that's just the beginning. And if it is not a physical disability, if in fact a passenger has sight impairment, most flights, most airlines do not currently have Braille placards that identify seats or the restroom. United, a few months ago, I think, announced that they are going to make all new planes have those Braille placards, which is a step in the right direction. We really applaud that. In addition, I think one of the biggest things that hampers people who have disabilities and makes travel inaccessible and, in fact, dangerous is the lack of accessible restrooms. I've never been on a flight that had an accessible restroom. And so even if someone can navigate their way through surrendering their wheelchair, being transported into the airline's wheelchair, getting to their seat, if they don't have the use of their legs, how are they going to get to the bathroom? And because they can't utilize the bathroom, many people with disabilities who do travel say the risk is twofold. They have to limit their intake of fluids and food prior to the flight so that they will not have to use that, and putting their health at risk. But even greater angst is created for them when they have to surrender their wheelchair, which in many cases, if they're motorized, cost upwards of $40,000, $50,000, $60,000. And every day in the United States, 31 wheelchairs are damaged, either minimally or irreparably by the airlines. That's another means. When I'm asked, well, what can airlines do? Are these all sound like huge things they have to do, big steps? No, that's not so. They don't have to take big steps. Just training airline personnel on how to handle carefully someone's wheelchair and maybe taking steps to ensure that those wheelchairs aren't damaged anymore would be a step in the right direction.
And I suppose the airline industry would say they have thousands of planes that are retrofitted in a certain configuration that doesn't allow access to the standard size wheelchair. So you can't remake all these planes, right?
Actually, no. Delta is proving that to not be the case. Delta is making progress towards creating a seat that can be configured on an airplane that can accommodate a full-size wheelchair. So the seat will just be removed, and then there'll be something on the floor that would accommodate a wheelchair preventing someone who utilizes a wheelchair from having to be transported. And when it is not in use by someone with a disability in a wheelchair, it can be a regular, full rate seat. So if if Delta can do that, everyone can do that. These aren't major retrofits. And just today on Instagram, major airline announced that they're rolling out a program to make snacks available, and have self-access snacks available. And I travel literally every week. I take 1 or 2 flights, typically on one major airline. And I see how quickly the airlines can roll out new programs. They do a really good job of caring for their passengers like me, who are 1Kers, who travel constantly. If they can do that good a job for everyone who travels so consistently, they can certainly make concessions and changes and modifications to make travel more accessible for a quarter of the American population that is disabled.
How do you want these changes to happen? It sounds like you might want congressional action, or are you thinking that the airlines are just on their own going to make these changes?
No, and in fact, Easterseals really believes that we need to come together, and that by coming together, meaning the United States government, the airline industry, airline manufacturers, disability advocates, and airports, we can make these changes happen more quickly. I think the airlines certainly need to make the physical changes, but the government could certainly help pave the way and mandate that those changes get made sooner than later. I think one of the things that gets lost in this conversation is that we focus on the cost and the difficulty rather than on the revenue and the benefit of making travel more accessible. We look at the 61 million and say, okay, well, that's the disabled community, it will benefit them, but there are millions of other passengers. Making airline travel accessible for everyone with a disability just makes good business sense. I want to get my figure right here. So families of people with disabilities and consumers who are disabled can activate more than $22 billion in buying power and have $490 billion in disposable income. If we make travel more accessible for them, more of those dollars get spent. Airlines sell more tickets. The tourism industry booms. More planes are built. Airline manufacturers, can sell more planes. And I think, more passengers mean more jobs, more opportunities. And truly, we see this writ large. We see this across every social health determinant when people with disabilities are involved in education. In other words, when education is made more accessible, more inclusive, when healthcare, when the workplace and travel are made more accessible and inclusive, everyone benefits. It makes life better.
How would you characterize this, the fact that, people with disabilities have such troubles traveling? There's the Americans with Disabilities Act that's supposed to protect people. Is this discriminatory in your opinion, or how would you characterize it?
I think when the ADA was passed 33 years ago, it did an awful lot of good. It made trains more accessible. If you've used Amtrak, you've seen they're accessible by wheelchair. There's a lift in every Amtrak train that can accommodate wheelchairs, and they've made even more modifications since the passage of the ADA. Cruise lines are more accessible than they were because of the ADA. Cabs, subways, you name it. The one transportation industry that was really given a pass 33 years ago was the airline industry. And there's just no need for it. We need to make air travel more accessible, and we need to do it now so that people with disabilities can travel freely, and we give them that right. It is their right. So do I think it's discriminatory? Yes. Do I think anyone's really at fault? No. But I do think that Easterseals and other disability organizations are standing at the ready, waiting for the USG, the airlines, and the airports to come to us and work with us so that we can make incremental steps that will help make airline travel more accessible.
Money is always an issue when you talk about these kinds of things. What do you say to their concerns that this would be too costly?
I just can't emphasize enough the buying power that it would unlock if air travel is made accessible and more of the 61 million Americans can travel. That's only going to be good for business. It's going to sell more tickets. It's going to negate the cost of retrofitting. And some of these changes aren't monumental. The placards, the Braille placards that I mentioned that that United has committed to doing, that's not an expensive change, but it's a big step in terms of helping make airplanes more accessible, more inclusive for people who are vision impaired. Also, not everything is a Herculean lift. The infotainment systems, I struggle. I struggle to make that work when I get on whether it's the volume or changing the channel, I really struggle. So if I am struggling, I can only imagine that someone who's vision impaired and has no braille struggles to use that infotainment. If it doesn't have closed captions, and most infotainment does not have closed captions, then if you're hearing impaired, that's not accessible either. I think we have to just shift the paradigm and stop thinking of this as a marginalized small population. The disabled community in the United States is the largest minority. Think about that. I mean, that's the largest minority in the United States. We have to stop thinking of them as a minority or as a small group, and rather make everything more accessible so that we're weaving people with disabilities into every social health determinant: education, transportation, healthcare, employment.
Very good. Thanks so much for taking the time for us today. I appreciate it. And here's to wishing everybody a healthy, happy, and safe holiday season.